Hi everyone, I hope 2023 is going amazing for you so far. As for me, I'm really excited about this new year. I have a whole half year's worth of content already planned out for YouTube. And then of course with my TikTok, I upload daily and I'm really looking forward to all the interesting cases that I'm going to be covering because I have some really good ones. Of course, most of them are unsolved, but the solved YouTube stories I'm planning on covering are super interesting. So if you like mysteries, make sure to follow my channel if you haven't already, and let's go ahead and get into today's case. I thought that this would be a good case to cover in January because January is actually Stalking Awareness Month. And this story is the story of Dorothy Jane Scott. She was a 32-year-old woman in California who was continuously harassed and threatened via these mysterious phone calls. Dorothy Jane Scott was born on April 23, 1948. She had two parents that lived nearby in Anaheim, California, and she was living with her aunt to help pay the bills since Dorothy was a single mother. She absolutely adored her 4-year-old son. I saw his name listed as Sean, and some places said it was Shanti, but I'm just going to call him Sean in this story. And Sean's father was not in the picture. He actually lived out of state. To make ends meet, Dorothy worked as the back office secretary in two jointly owned psychedelic shops and head shops, and these were Swingers, and then the head shop was John's Custom Head Shop. This went along with the hippie culture of the 70s, and again, this was California, but Dorothy herself was actually not into drinking or drugs. She was described as a devout Christian who was devoted to her son. Her coworkers said that she didn't really have much going on, and one even described her as, quote, dull as a phone book. In fact, I'm pretty sure she only worked at this shop because her dad had previously worked there doing, I think, custodial work, and her two parents would babysit her son while she was at work. Dorothy's father said she may have dated on occasion but did not have a steady boyfriend because, again, Sean was priority one. So even though Dorothy had a pretty mundane lifestyle, she was dealing with one of the scariest things a person can experience. Someone was watching her every move. Some days, mostly when Dorothy was at work, she would receive these really odd phone calls. A male's voice would be on the other end of the line, and he would tell her how beautiful she was and how he wanted to marry her. One time, this person called the house phone of where Dorothy was living with her aunt, and he said that he had a gift for her. So she asked him what it was, and he told her to step outside. She walked outside, and this was broad daylight, by the way, and someone had laid a dead rose on the windshield of her car. Like, how creepy is that? This man seemed to have a very odd obsession with Dorothy. He would constantly call her, and even in these phone calls, he would sometimes describe what she was wearing that day. But these calls kind of took a turn for the worse. I mean, of course, they were creepy anyway, but they became very aggressive. In the weeks leading up to her death, these phone calls changed from him like complimenting her to him threatening her life. And in one of these calls, he even said, quote, "When I get you alone, I'm going to cut you into tiny pieces and no one will ever find you." So, what the hell? Dorothy was obviously freaked out by this, and she spoke to her colleagues about possibly getting karate lessons so she could defend herself. She also talked about the possibility of getting a gun, but again, she was worried about having something like that in the house with a small child. This stalker knew Dorothy's work schedule and would describe her outfits. It really seemed like this guy had a lot of free time and would just watch her every single day because he knew where she lived, he knew where and when she was working, because he would call the office. Dorothy also said that this voice sounded familiar, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. She said that he would speak in this gruff way to kind of disguise his voice. I imagine it's kind of like when Christian Bale is speaking as Batman. You can't exactly tell it's his voice, but like if you knew him pretty well, you would be able to identify it. So Dorothy thought that she must have known this person in some way, but not super closely. And it's so scary because this was all before caller caller ID. And if Dorothy wanted to go to the police, they wouldn't do anything because stalking wasn't illegal until 1996 when Congress passed the Violence Against Women Act. Dorothy really didn't have any other choice but to continue living her life. This brings us to May 28th, 1980. There was an all-hands meeting at Dorothy's workplace, so all of the employees gathered at one of the stores. As this meeting continued, Dorothy began to notice that one of her coworkers was acting odd, and this behavior was getting worse. In fact, other employees started to notice as well. This man, who was named Conrad, seemed really sweaty and uncomfortable, and he also had a red rash on his arm. At the end of the meeting, Dorothy and their other coworker, Pam Head, insisted on taking him to the hospital. So they all loaded into Dorothy's station wagon, and before dropping by the hospital, she decided to drop by her parents' house just to check in on her son. It was while she was here that she decided to change her black scarf to a red scarf. This was California in May, so I don't think it was like a wool scarf to keep you warm. I think it was one of those like silk ascots that they'd wear in Scooby-Doo. They got to the hospital, and thank God they did, because Conrad was diagnosed with having a black widow spider bite. While Conrad was being treated, Dorothy and Pam sat in the waiting room, and Pam says that Dorothy's demeanor didn't seem anxious at all. She seemed pretty normal, and they were just chatting and reading magazines. She also says that Dorothy did not get up and speak to anybody or make a phone call during this time. By the time Conrad was discharged, it was nighttime, and he and the coworker went down to the hospital's pharmacy to get a prescription filled. While they were doing this, Dorothy walked out to the parking lot to get her car, and this wasn't like a parking garage like most hospitals have now. This was just an open parking lot where you could freely go in and out without buying a ticket. The two coworkers walked outside expecting to see Dorothy sitting curbside in her white Toyota station wagon, but she wasn't there, and they waited about 15 minutes before they decided to just walk to the parking lot themselves. It's when they're walking to the parking lot that they see Dorothy's car turn the corner and start heading directly towards them. They start waving their arms, but they notice that the car is instead speeding up. So they like jump out of the way, and the car was like speeding towards them with its headlights on. So the headlights were basically blinding them, and they couldn't see who was driving the car. They just said that it made a beeline out of the parking lot where it continued to speed up. Wondering if there was perhaps an emergency with her kid, Conrad and Pam waited for about 2 hours before calling Dorothy's parents. Dorothy's parents hadn't heard from her, so then they decided to call the police to the hospital and file a missing persons report. Of course, like in most of the cases I cover, the police are not concerned with Dorothy's safety, and they think she just forgot that she had to run an errand or something and drove off. However, everyone's concern increased about 5 hours later at 4:30 a.m. Dorothy's 1973 Toyota station wagon was found engulfed in flames. This made it pretty clear that she'd been abducted and some kind of foul play was involved, but Dorothy or the perpetrator were not found in or near the car, but Dorothy's stuff was found inside. In the initial days of the investigation, the police actually asked Dorothy's parents to keep a tight lip and to not speak to the media. I guess they didn't want their abductor to catch on to something, but usually in a missing persons case, talking to the media is one of the best things you can do. But a week after Dorothy's disappearance, the phone rang at the Scott family home. Dorothy's mother, Vera, was home alone, and she picked up. The caller was a male voice, and he asked, "Are you related to Dorothy Scott?" And when she answered yes, he said, "I've got her," and hung up. This was the final straw, and Dorothy's father decided to go to the media. The Santa Ana Register published a story on the Dorothy Scott case, and that very same day, the editor of the newspaper received a call at his desk. It was the stalker. He told the newspaper that he was in love with Dorothy, but he caught her cheating with another man, so he had to kill her. And he said this twice during the call. Twice during the call, he said that he killed Dorothy. The newspaper editor also said he'd been in the business a really long time, and he could tell when someone was bluffing and when they were being genuine, and this person was absolutely telling the truth. During this conversation, he mentioned how Dorothy changed scarves, and this was not released to the media in any way. So this is how they knew that this was the actual person who must have taken Dorothy. He also said that Dorothy called him to tell him how Conrad got bitten by a spider, but this directly contradicts what Pam said when she said that Dorothy didn't make any phone calls while they were waiting. I think it's possible that Dorothy could have called somebody without Pam realizing. Despite these sketchy phone calls, there were no leads in the case of Dorothy Scott, and these phone calls continued on, torturing her poor parents. Like, it's bad enough to know that your child is out there somewhere and you don't know where they are, but to have somebody calling you day after day, taunting you. These calls were usually brief and usually occurred when Dorothy's mom was home alone, and the caller would often taunt her or ask if Dorothy was there or tell her that he had her daughter. These were absolutely horrible, heartless calls. Whoever was doing this absolutely was a sadist because they enjoyed messing with her parents. These calls happened about once a week for 4 years. That's over 200 calls total, and they would usually occur on Wednesdays, which is another interesting detail. But on one of these Wednesdays in April 1984, Dorothy's dad happened to be home and he was the one who answered the phone. The caller hung up immediately, and this must have been the stalker because then the calls stopped for a short period of time. Maybe this caller knew Dorothy's dad, and that's why he hung up quickly, because he knew that Dorothy's dad would recognize his voice, kind of like how Dorothy almost recognized the voice. Like, maybe it was a friend of the family, or again, because Dorothy's dad had previously worked at the head shop, then it could have been somebody who worked at the head shop as well. Also, I personally believe that men who commit acts of violence against women are pathetic cowards deep inside, and I think it's really possible that he's completely fine with taunting and threatening and hurting a woman, but when a man comes into the picture, he runs away with his tail tucked between his legs, and I think it's really possible that he just completely bitched out and hung up the phone. On August 6th, 1984, a construction worker came across the remains of a dog and a human. These bones were side by side about 30 feet from Santa Ana Canyon Road. The bones are partially charred, and the authorities estimated that they'd been there for at least 2 years because a bushfire had occurred in 1982. A turquoise ring and watch were also recovered, and Dorothy's mom confirmed these as belonging to her daughter. The watch, interestingly enough, had stopped at 12:30 a.m. on May 29th. This was about an hour after Conrad and Pam had last seen Dorothy's car. So about an hour basically after the abduction. And just as the caller had said, only parts of Dorothy were found. These included a skull, a pelvis, 1 arm bone, and 2 leg bones. The level of decomposition was too far along for them to really get any sort of forensic information from these bones. They couldn't determine the cause of death, and they also couldn't determine if she'd been SA'd. But I did look up the reasons why a watch would stop ticking, and some of the reasons that Google said were brute force. So maybe somebody ended up like beating Dorothy, and then also water damage. So like maybe she was submerged in water for a period of time. But again, they could have also just like smashed the watch in some way. Unfortunately, because so much time had passed, they also don't know how long Dorothy was kept captive by this person. After Dorothy's remains were found in the August of 1984, the family started receiving calls again. They were the same kind of calls where they'd just be like threatening the family or taunting them about how they killed their daughter. The police this time though did set up a voice recorder at the Scott's residence, but they also wanted to try to track these calls, but the caller never stayed on for long enough. Dorothy's family had to continue living their lives like this, and honestly, I feel so horrible for them because in 2023, Dorothy Scott's case is still unsolved and both of her parents have passed away. Her son Sean still fights for justice in her case, but as of right now, there have been no formal suspects publicly announced, but I am going to go into some potential suspects in Dorothy's case. So in any disappearance/murder, they're going to look into those who were romantically involved with the victim. Like Dorothy's father said, she didn't really date, she was kind kind of a homebody, but it's possible that she went on like a single date months or years earlier and this person just never got over her. They also looked into the father of Dorothy's kid, but he was determined to be out of state at the time. Because Dorothy recognized the voice of this caller and that caller immediately hung up when her father answered the phone, people think that it could be somebody who's related to their place of work in some way. This could be one of Dorothy's co-workers or a regular customer, although she was a back office secretary, so she wasn't really upfront talking to customers that much. One possible suspect is John Casilla, who was actually the owner of this shop, hence John's head shop. And again, that makes sense that he would hang up the phone when Dorothy's dad answered because he knew Dorothy's dad pretty well. It would also make sense that her boss would know about Conrad's spider bite, whether he heard about it in the following days at work, or maybe even Dorothy called from the waiting room just to update all of their coworkers and to tell them that Conrad was going to be okay. But again, the fact that the killer would know about the spider bite could also mean that he accused Dorothy of cheating on him because she had been with Conrad that day, and then maybe she told her own killer, no, like we're not romantically involved, he's my coworker and he needed my help. The dead dog found near her body has made a lot of people suspect that Dorothy's death had something to do with the occult. Dorothy wasn't into witchcraft or anything like that. She was a Christian, but again, this was also the satanic panic of the 80s, and a lot of people thought that a lot of things had to do with Satanism and witchcraft. I think it's possible that whoever did this purposefully put dog remains near her body because I don't think the dog just happened to die near Dorothy. I do think that they were buried together, but people think that the killer could have put the dog remains near her body to kind of mask the scent. And then also, if you came across bones and you saw that there was like a dead dog, then maybe you would stop looking and not realize that there were human remains right next to that. Through Dorothy's son's own research, he has come up with another possible suspect, and that is a man named Mike Butler. Mike Butler is related to one of Dorothy's co-workers, and he actually lived in the mountains near where her body was found. He was a pretty eccentric guy and was said to deal with the occult, which again explains the dog. Mike Butler did pass away in 2014, and he was never formally announced as a suspect in Dorothy's case. In fact, there were no suspects that were ever publicly announced as being like interrogated or just being questioned in relation to Dorothy's case. And the last theory I'm going to talk about is that this was the work of the Golden State Killer. The Golden State Killer was identified and arrested in 2018 through DNA, and he was a pretty well-known perpetrator in the California area. He would stalk and terrorize his victims with creepy phone calls prior to killing them. He would also break into people's houses and essay them, and he would like call them and like mock them afterwards. This differs from Dorothy's case, not because she didn't receive all of these creepy phone calls, because she did, but these phone calls were creepy and violent, but they were also creepy and like romantic. It does seem like this person had a weird adoration for Dorothy, but this wasn't the MO of the Golden State Killer. He was pure madness, pure hatred. Some of Dorothy's phone calls were romantic, and the Golden State Killer does not have any of this like on his record. Like he would call and like be romantically obsessed with somebody. He would just call and scare them basically. At the end of his sentencing, he did end up making an apology to his victims. He has never admitted to or talked about the murder of Dorothy Scott as far as the public knows. And that's all the information I have for you guys on the death of Dorothy Jane Scott. I'm going to leave a number in the description box if you have any information that could lead to an arrest in her case, because again, this is unsolved. We don't know who is making those creepy phone calls, but we do know that whoever it was, they ended up taking Dorothy's life from her. I thought that Dorothy's story was really important to talk about, especially given that January is Stalking Awareness Month. Dorothy's story is a very exaggerated case of stalking, and it ends in basically worst case scenario murder. But I do think it's really important to be aware of these situations and to understand the red flags as they're coming up, because somebody calling you and complimenting you and like even knowing when you're at work, if you don't know who they are, this is like threatening behavior, and in some form or fashion it is meant to scare you, and like that's the official definition of stalking. Stalking is unwanted contact, and that is meant to scare or threaten the victim. So I hope you liked this video. If you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe subscribe to my channel. And if you like short form mystery content rather than videos that are longer like this one, I upload daily to my TikTok, which is Celestial Sylvia. Also, if you could do me a huge favor and leave a thumbs up on this video, like it to let me know that you enjoy content like this and that I should keep creating more. Thanks for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day and stay safe.